Wren Lockhart, 28, never imagined that her own parents would become her worst enemies. When I discovered the decades-long web of lies my family had spun around me, all to control my inheritance and keep me dependent, I had a choice: stay broken, or rebuild myself into someone they couldn't recognize. The day I walked into that family reunion, head held high with my secret evidence, my parents' smug smiles melted into expressions of pure terror. Before we dive into my story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. If you enjoy family revenge dramas that serve up the perfect portion of justice, please hit that like button and subscribe to join our storytelling community. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for the moment my family realizes karma doesn't forget addresses. I grew up in a picture-perfect suburb of Boston, the kind where neighbors compete over lawn ornaments and everyone pretends their lives are flawless. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Lockhart, were respected figures in our community, Dad as a financial advisor with his own firm, Mom as the head of several charity boards. From the outside, we were the ideal American family: successful parents, a beautiful colonial home, and me, their only daughter who supposedly had every advantage. "You're so lucky," friends would tell me. "Your parents give you everything." If only they could have seen behind our perfectly painted front door. The earliest memory I have of something being wrong was my 6th birthday. While most children receive toys or clothes, my father presented me with a savings account passbook. "This is where we'll keep your inheritance money safe," he explained, with what I now recognize as a calculated smile. "One day, when you're much older and can handle responsibility, it will all be yours." That inheritance came from my maternal grandmother Evelyn, who had passed away the year before. She'd been a savvy businesswoman who'd built a small empire in real estate during a time when female entrepreneurs were rare. According to family stories, she'd adored me as a baby and had set aside a substantial trust fund specifically for me. Growing up, my parents used that inheritance as both a carrot and a stick. When I excelled, they'd remind me how my success would prove I deserved Grandma Evelyn's money. When I failed, they'd shake their heads and lament how disappointed she would be. "Good thing we're keeping it safe until you're mature enough," my mother would say with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. The rules in our house were clear but contradictory. I was expected to be independent, yet follow their strict guidelines without question. I needed to be ambitious but never more successful than them. I should be confident but never challenge their authority. The psychological tightrope was exhausting, and I frequently tumbled. School became my escape. I excelled academically, finding solace in books and learning. My teachers praised my intelligence and critical thinking, calling me gifted and exceptional. At home, however, these same traits were deemed troublesome. "You think too much," my father would say whenever I questioned their decisions. "Always overthinking everything," my mother would echo, exchanging knowing glances with Dad. When college application time arrived, I naturally gravitated toward prestigious universities. With my perfect GPA and impressive extracurricular activities, I received acceptance letters from several Ivy League schools. My heart was set on Cornell's architecture program. I'd dreamed of designing buildings since I was 12. "Cornell," my father laughed when I shared the news. "That's unnecessarily expensive. The state university has a perfectly adequate program and it's closer to home." "But I've been accepted with a partial scholarship," I argued. My mother's voice turned icy. "Partial doesn't mean full, Wren. Be realistic. Your inheritance isn't meant for frivolous educational experiments." That was the first time I directly asked about my inheritance. "How much is actually in my trust fund? Shouldn't it cover education?" That's what Grandma Evelyn would have wanted. The silence that followed was deafening. My parents exchanged that look, the one I'd seen countless times but could never quite decipher. "You're not mature enough to handle those details," my father finally said. "The trust has specific conditions. Education is provided for, but we determine what's appropriate." I attended the state university commuting from home because they insisted it made financial sense. Throughout my undergraduate years, I watched as my peers gained independence, while I remained tethered to my parents' control. Every financial decision required their approval always, with the reminder that they were protecting my inheritance. By the time I graduated with my architecture degree, I developed severe anxiety and a persistent feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with my family dynamics. Little did I know that my graduation would mark the beginning of a discovery that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my parents and my grandmother's legacy. The first red flag appeared when I landed an entry-level position at a respected architecture firm in Boston. Instead of celebrating my achievement, my parents seemed concerned. "Are you sure you're ready for that kind of pressure?" my mother asked. Her forehead creased with what I misinterpreted as genuine worry. "The commute will be awful," my father added. "And Boston rents are ridiculous. It makes more sense to stay home and look for something local." That night, I overheard them arguing in hushed tones. "She's getting too independent," my mother hissed. "What if she starts asking questions? What if someone at that firm knows about Evelyn's properties?" "Keep your voice down," my father responded. "We've managed for 22 years. A few more and it's all legally ours anyway." I froze outside their door, my heart pounding. What did they mean by legally ours? What was I not supposed to know about my grandmother's properties? Those whispered words planted a seed of suspicion that would eventually grow into the revelation that would change everything. The architecture firm I joined, Harrington and Associates, specialized in historical renovations throughout New England. My first 6 months were a blur of blueprint reviews, site visits, and learning the intricacies of preserving historical integrity while modernizing spaces. Despite my parents' constant undermining, I thrived in this environment where my opinions and ideas were actually valued. 3 months into my job, my supervisor assigned me to help document a row of Victorian townhouses slated for renovation in Beacon Hill. As I photographed ornate moldings and measured century-old door frames, something about the address nagged at me. 42 Acorn Street. Why did it sound familiar? That evening, while my parents attended a charity gala, I ventured into our attic, where boxes of family documents were stored. I'd never had much interest in them before, but something compelled me to search through them now. In a dusty folder labeled Evelyn Properties, I found my answer. My hands trembled as I unfolded a yellowed property deed. 42 Acorn Street. Owned by Evelyn Montgomery Lockhart, my grandmother. According to the document, this property, along with several others, had been specifically bequeathed to me in her will, with my parents designated only as trustees until I turned 25. I was 23. For 2 hours I sat cross-legged on the attic floor, piecing together the truth through decades of papers my parents had hidden away. The inheritance wasn't just a savings account. It was an entire portfolio of prime real estate properties throughout Boston, a significant investment account, and shares in several blue-chip companies. My grandmother had been wealthier than I'd ever imagined, and she'd left everything to me. More disturbingly, I discovered letters from grandmother Evelyn to me, letters I'd never received. In them, she described her hope that I would use my inheritance to pursue my dreams without constraint, to travel, to experience life on my own terms. "Your mother fears independence," one letter stated. "Don't let her fear become yours." The most damning document was a copy of the actual trust agreement. It stipulated that I was to receive full control of my inheritance at 25, with graduated access beginning at 18 for education, and at 21 for housing and career development. There were no maturity conditions or restrictions, giving my parents decision-making authority. They had been lying to me my entire life. As the truth crystallized, so did the realization that my parents had been systematically embezzling from my trust. Bank statements showed regular transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. Property management reports indicated rental income from my grandmother's property's income that had never been mentioned to me, let alone provided for my benefit. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined. This wasn't just financial fraud. It was a deliberate campaign to keep me dependent, insecure, and under their control. My entire identity had been shaped by their manipulation, the anxiety, the self-doubt, the feeling that I was never quite good enough to handle my own affairs. It had all been by design. I carefully replaced everything except copies of the most crucial documents which I secured in my work bag. My mind raced with questions and emotions too complex to process. How much had they stolen? Were they planning to somehow prevent me from ever gaining control at 25? What would happen if I confronted them directly? The next day at work, I could barely focus. During lunch, I escaped to a cafe across the street and called the one person I thought might have answers, my mother's estranged sister, Aunt Caroline. We'd had minimal contact over the years. My parents had always dismissed her as troubled and jealous of our family's success. "Ren," her voice sounded surprised when she answered. "I haven't heard from you since your high school graduation." "Aunt Caroline, I need to ask you something important," I said, my voice barely steady. "What do you know about Grandmother Evelyn's will and my inheritance?" The silence that followed spoke volumes. When she finally responded, her voice was heavy with long-held anger. "You found out, didn't you, God? I've been waiting for this day for years." Over the next hour, Aunt Caroline filled in the blanks. She'd tried to challenge my parents' management of the trust when I was younger, but lacked the legal standing. The family rift wasn't because she was troubled, it was because she'd confronted my parents about their misappropriation of my inheritance. "Your mother always resented how your grandmother favored you," Aunt Caroline explained. "Eleanor expected to inherit everything as the only daughter. When Evelyn left it all to you with only a small portion for Eleanor, something broke in your mother. Your father saw an opportunity and convinced her they deserved to use what should have been yours." By the end of our conversation, I had the name of Grandmother Evelyn's former attorney and a standing invitation to stay with Aunt Caroline if I needed to escape my parents' home. I also had something I'd lacked my entire life: clarity about who my parents really were. That evening, I returned home to find my parents in the living room, glasses of wine in hand, discussing an upcoming charity auction. They looked up with their usual mixture of judgment and forced affection. "You're home late," my mother observed. "That firm is working you too hard. I told you it wasn't a good fit." I studied their faces, these people who had systematically stolen not just my money but my confidence and independence. A cold determination settled in my chest. "Actually," I replied with a calmness I didn't feel, "I think it's a perfect fit. I'm learning so much." I decided then that I wouldn't confront them, not yet. First, I needed to understand the full scope of their deception, secure what remained of my inheritance, and most importantly, develop the strength and independence they had deliberately tried to prevent me from achieving. My parents had spent 23 years molding me into someone they could control. It was time for me to become someone they would fear. For the next 6 months, I lived a double life. On the surface, I remained the dutiful daughter still living at home, still seemingly accepting my parents' guidance about my career and finances. But beneath this facade, I was methodically building my case and planning my escape. My first step was contacting Thomas Whitaker, my grandmother's attorney. Now in his 70s and semi-retired, he agreed to meet me for coffee one Saturday morning while my parents thought I was at a work event. "I've been wondering when you'd come looking for answers," he said after I explained my discovery. His weathered face showed a mixture of relief and regret. "I tried to keep tabs on the trust management, but your parents changed the financial institutions several times, making it difficult to track." "Why didn't you ever reach out to me directly?" I asked, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. He sighed heavily. "I attempted to, when you turned 18. Your parents intercepted my letters. When I tried calling, they told me you weren't interested in being bothered with financial matters, and had authorized them to continue managing everything. He shook his head. I should have been more persistent, but they presented documentation, apparently forged, showing you had signed an extension of their trustee status. Though it was difficult to forgive his failure to protect my interests, I needed Thomas's expertise. Together, we developed a strategy to reclaim my inheritance. The good news, he explained, is that you turn 25 inches 9 months. According to the original trust documents, your parents' trustee status automatically terminates on your 25th birthday, regardless of any modifications they may have manufactured. And the bad news: they've had 2 decades to divert assets. We need to act quickly to freeze what remains and document what's been misappropriated. Thomas put me in touch with a forensic accountant named Maya Desai, who specialized in cases of financial fraud. During our first meeting in her downtown office, she didn't sugarcoat the situation. Based on the documents you've provided, I estimate your parents have diverted approximately 60% of your inheritance, she said, sliding a preliminary report across her desk. The number at the bottom of the page made me dizzy. Even after their theft, my inheritance remained substantial, over $2 million in properties and investments, but they had stolen nearly $3 million more. Can we get it back? I asked. Some of it, possibly. We'll need to trace where the money went. If they've spent it on personal expenses, or commingled it with their own assets, recovery becomes complicated. However, if they've simply transferred it to other accounts or purchased identifiable assets with the funds, our chances improve. While Thomas worked on the legal strategy and Maya tracked the money trail, I focused on building my independence. I opened a new bank account at a different bank, using my aunt's address for correspondence. I began saving aggressively from my architecture firm, salary living frugally, despite my parents' encouragement to enjoy your youth while we handle the serious financial matters. I also reconnected with Aunt Caroline, visiting her home in Providence every few weekends, supposedly for professional networking events. My aunt became my strongest ally and emotional support as I processed the magnitude of my parents' betrayal. They've always been this way, she told me during one visit. Your mother was jealous of anyone who received attention or praise, and your father enabled her worst tendencies. When your grandmother doted on you, it triggered something toxic in Eleanor. Did grandmother Evelyn know what they were like? Why would she make them my trustees? Caroline's expression softened. Evelyn had a blind spot when it came to Eleanor. She always hoped her daughter would rise to responsibility if given the chance. Plus, the trustee arrangement was meant to be temporary, just until you reached adulthood. She never imagined they would manipulate you for so long. In my professional life, I sought opportunities that would strengthen my position. When a senior colleague mentioned an opening for a project manager at a prestigious firm in New York, I quietly submitted my application. The significantly higher salary and relocation would be my ticket to complete independence from my parents. The most delicate aspect of my plan involved my extended family. My parents hosted an annual family reunion every 4th of July at our home, an event where they carefully curated the image of our perfect family while subtly reminding everyone of their financial success and my supposed dependency. This year's reunion would mark my 25th birthday, and the day I would finally confront them with the truth. As the months passed, Thomas secured court orders to freeze the remaining trust assets, preventing my parents from transferring or liquidating anything else before my birthday. Maya documented transfers dating back 20 years, creating a comprehensive record of their systematic theft. The evidence was damning. 2 weeks before the reunion, I received the job offer from New York. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. I signed the contract and secured an apartment in Manhattan, without telling my parents, arranging for my essential belongings to be moved to Aunt Caroline's house until after the confrontation. The night before my birthday, I sat alone in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by boxes I had quietly packed over the previous weeks. Tomorrow, everything would change. My parents had spent decades crafting a narrative that painted them as protective, responsible guardians, and me as incapable of managing my own affairs. Their carefully constructed facade was about to shatter. I felt a strange calm as I reviewed the documents I would present at the reunion: the trust agreement, the forensic accounting report, the property deeds, and the court orders already in place. This wasn't just about reclaiming my financial inheritance, it was about reclaiming my identity and my future. My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Caroline. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" I typed back, "More ready than they could ever imagine." As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about my grandmother Evelyn, a woman whose true legacy had been hidden from me. Tomorrow I would finally honor her wishes by becoming the independent, confident woman she had always intended me to be. July 4th arrived with the kind of perfect weather that seemed to mock the storm I was about to unleash. By noon, our backyard was filled with relatives from both sides of the family: aunts, uncles, cousins, and a few family friends who had attended every reunion for as long as I could remember. My parents were in their element, playing the gracious hosts. My father manned the grill, telling the same tired jokes he recycled every year. My mother flitted between guests with trays of her famous deviled eggs, collecting compliments like trophies. Both of them periodically glanced my way, their smiles tightening whenever they noticed me engaged in lengthy conversations with relatives they had long tried to limit my contact with. Aunt Caroline arrived fashionably late, causing a palpable tension. My mother's back stiffened at the sight of her estranged sister, but social propriety demanded civility at family gatherings. When Caroline embraced me with a conspiratorial wink, I felt a surge of confidence. I wasn't alone in this battle. Thomas Whitaker and Maya Desai would arrive at 3 p.m. precisely when my father traditionally gathered everyone for his annual family State of the Union speech, a pretentious ritual where he boasted about the Lockhart family accomplishments over the past year, with heavy emphasis on his and my mother's achievements. As the afternoon progressed, I mingled with relatives I'd been discouraged from knowing well. My father's brother, Uncle James, mentioned that he'd tried to visit me several times during my college years. "Your parents always said you were too busy with studies," he remarked with a puzzled expression. "I got the impression you weren't interested in maintaining family connections." "That's strange," I replied, maintaining my composure despite my internal fury at discovering yet another manipulation. "I was never told you wanted to visit." Similar conversations with other relatives revealed a pattern my parents had systematically isolated me from family members who might have offered alternative perspectives or support. The web of control was more extensive than I'd imagined. At 2:30, I excused myself to freshen up and retrieved the documents from my bedroom. My hands trembled slightly as I placed everything in a leather portfolio, not from fear, but from the adrenaline of finally taking control. Through my window, I spotted Thomas and Maya walking up the driveway, punctual as planned. When I returned to the backyard, my parents were already eyeing the newcomers with suspicion. My father approached me, his voice low and tense. "Who are these people, Ren? This is a family event." I met his gaze steadily. "They're here at my invitation. You'll understand shortly." Confusion flickered across his face. In all my life, I had never spoken to him with such confidence, or defied his wishes so directly. Before he could respond, I walked away to greet Thomas and Maya, introducing them loudly enough for nearby relatives to hear. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Thomas Whitaker, grandmother Evelyn's attorney, and Maya Desai, a forensic accountant. They're here to help me share some important information with the family." My mother nearly dropped the platter she was holding. She rushed over, her social smile strained to the breaking point. "Ren, darling, what is this about? Today is hardly the time for business matters." "Actually, Mother, I can't think of a more appropriate time," I replied. After all, we have the entire family gathered to celebrate the Lockhart legacy. And today is my 25th birthday, a significant milestone, wouldn't you agree? The blood drained from her face at my emphasis on 25. She knew exactly what that number meant, according to Grandmother Evelyn's trust. My father appeared at her side attempting damage control. Well, everyone's enjoying themselves. Let's not disrupt the festivities with paperwork and legal talk. He placed a firm hand on my shoulder, trying to guide me away from Thomas and Maya. I stepped out of his reach. Dad, I insist. In fact, since you're about to give your annual family address, I thought we could combine it with my announcement. The look that passed between my parents contained pure panic. For the first time in my life, I saw them afraid not for me but of me. The power dynamic had shifted and they knew it. By now, the entire gathering had noticed the tension. Relatives watched with curious expressions as my usually controlled parents appeared increasingly agitated. Aunt Caroline strategically positioned herself near my cousins, ready to provide context once everything was revealed. At precisely 3 p.m., my father cleared his throat and clinked his glass in his traditional call for attention. With no other options that wouldn't create an obvious scene, he attempted to maintain the facade of normalcy. Family and friends, welcome to our annual Lockhart 4th of July celebration. He began, his voice lacking its usual bombastic confidence. As is tradition, I'd like to share some family highlights from the past year. He launched into an abbreviated version of his usual speech, highlighting his firm's growth and my mother's charity work. When he perfunctorily mentioned my continuing progress at the architecture firm, I stepped forward. Actually, Dad, I have some updates of my own to share. I turned to address the gathered family directly. Today isn't just Independence Day for our country, it's Independence Day for me in more ways than one. The yard fell silent as I opened my portfolio and removed the first document, a copy of Grandmother Evelyn's original trust agreement. Many of you knew my grandmother Evelyn Montgomery Lockhart. What you may not know is the true nature of her legacy and how it has been systematically mismanaged for the past 2 decades. My mother surged forward. Wren, this is inappropriate and unnecessary. Is it, Mother? Because I think the family deserves to know the truth about the Lockhart finances they've heard so much about over the years. With methodical precision, I began revealing the evidence. The original trust, documents showing my full inheritance rights beginning at age 25. The property deeds in my name. The forensic accounting report detailing millions in diverted funds. The court orders already in place freezing the remaining assets. As I spoke, my parents' expressions transformed from desperate damage control to stunned disbelief. They had never imagined I would discover the truth, let alone have the courage to expose them publicly. For my entire life, I continued, I've been told I wasn't responsible enough, mature enough, or capable enough to manage my own inheritance. I've been made to feel dependent and inadequate. Today, I want everyone to understand that this narrative was a deliberate strategy to maintain control over assets that were never theirs to begin with. Relatives gasped as Maya presented her findings on the projected value of my inheritance had it been properly managed, versus what remained after my parents' systematic pillaging. Even my father's closest allies in the family looked horrified at the magnitude of the deception. Wren, you're misinterpreting everything, my father finally interjected, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. We protected your inheritance, you have no idea the complexities involved. Save it, Dad, I cut him off. The documents speak for themselves. And Thomas here has already filed motions to recover the misappropriated funds. My mother abandoned all pretense of composure. How dare you embarrass us like this? After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay our years of sacrifice and guidance. I felt a strange sense of calm as I watched her mask crumble completely. Sacrifice. You've sacrificed nothing. You've lived luxuriously on money that was never yours, all while convincing me I was incapable of independence. Looking around at my relatives' stunned faces, I decided it was time for the final revelation. There's one more thing everyone should know. As of Monday, I'll be relocating to New York. I've accepted a position as project manager at Werner and Associates Architecture, and I've already secured an apartment paid for with my own salary, not my inheritance. The expressions on my parents' faces in that moment made every painful year of manipulation worth it. They looked utterly lost, as if the daughter they thought they knew had been replaced by a stranger. In a way, they were right. The dependent, insecure Wren they had carefully molded no longer existed. As the murmuring among the relatives grew louder, I heard my phone chime with a notification. Taking it out, I smiled at the screen before addressing the gathering once more. I've just received confirmation that the courts have officially recognized my full control over all remaining trust assets, as of today, my 25th birthday, exactly as Grandmother Evelyn intended. I turned to my shell-shocked parents. Happy Independence Day to me. Hey everyone, this story is getting intense, right? If you're feeling that mix of shock and satisfaction seeing Wren finally stand up to her manipulative parents, I'd love to know what you think might happen next. Will her parents try to justify their actions? Will other family members take sides? Drop your predictions in the comments below. And if you're enjoying this family revenge drama, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that deliver sweet justice. Now let's see how this confrontation plays out. The backyard erupted into chaos after my announcement. Relatives clustered in shocked groups, their holiday barbecue plates forgotten as they processed what they'd just learned. My father's brother, Uncle James, was the first to approach me directly. I always wondered why they were so protective of you, he said, shaking his head in disbelief. Your grandmother was a shrewd businesswoman. She would be proud of how you've handled this. Aunt Caroline stood beside me now, her hand resting supportively on my shoulder as we watched my parents' desperate attempts at damage control. My mother had cornered her cousin Sarah, speaking rapidly with animated gestures while repeatedly glancing my way. My father had retreated to his study with his two closest friends from college, presumably to craft some narrative that might salvage their reputation. They won't go down without a fight, Caroline murmured. Eleanor has always excelled at spinning narratives to her advantage. Let them try, I replied, feeling strangely detached from the outcome. The documents speak for themselves. Thomas Whitaker approached with a glass of water. You did well, he said, his voice tinged with both approval and regret. I should have fought harder for you years ago. We can't change the past, I told him. But we can certainly secure the future. Maya Desai was surrounded by my more financially savvy relatives, explaining the intricacies of the forensic accounting report. I overheard phrases like systematic diversion of funds and clear pattern of misappropriation as she methodically dismantled any possible defense my parents might attempt to construct. My mother's older brother, Uncle Philip, approached me next. Unlike the others, his expression wasn't sympathetic but calculating. He'd always been my father's closest ally in the family, benefiting from investment opportunities my father had steered his way over the years. Wren, he began, his tone carefully measured, while this is certainly concerning, I think airing family financial matters so publicly lacks discretion. Perhaps we should discuss this privately, find some middle ground that preserves the family's reputation. I studied him, wondering how many of my parents' schemes he had been privy to over the years. There is no middle ground with fraud, Uncle Philip. And I'm not concerned with preserving a reputation built on lies. He flinched at the word fraud, his eyes darting toward the house where my father remained hidden. Your parents made mistakes, certainly, but they've always had your best interests at heart. They provided you with a comfortable life education. They provided me with the bare minimum they could get away with, while living lavishly on money that was never theirs, I interrupted. And they did everything possible to undermine my independence and self-confidence to maintain their control. Before he could respond, the sliding glass door to the patio opened. My parents emerged together, their postures rigid with forced dignity. They had clearly decided on their strategy during their retreat. My father cleared his throat loudly, calling for everyone's attention once more. Family. He began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he'd used throughout my childhood, to silence questions. There has been an unfortunate misunderstanding today. While Ren has indeed come into her inheritance, which we have diligently protected and grown for her benefit, she has been misled about certain aspects of our financial management. My mother stepped forward, her eyes glistening with perfectly timed tears. We only ever wanted what was best for our daughter. Every decision we made was to protect her future. Yes, we may have been overly cautious in how we allocated funds, but our intentions were pure. Several relatives shifted uncomfortably, uncertain who to believe. This was exactly what my parents had counted on, their decades-long reputation as upstanding community leaders, versus my seemingly sudden accusations. I felt a momentary flicker of doubt. They were masterful manipulators, and for a second I wondered if others would see through their performance. Then I remembered the years of gaslighting, the deliberate undermining of my confidence, the isolation from supportive family members, and my resolve hardened. Maya, I called across the yard, could you please explain to everyone the difference between cautious allocation and embezzlement? Maya stepped forward, professional and direct. Based on my analysis, approximately $3 million was diverted from Ren's trust into personal accounts and expenses for Richard and Eleanor Lockhart. These diversions were disguised through a series of shell companies and fraudulent management fees. This pattern goes well beyond cautious management and meets the legal definition of embezzlement and breach of fiduciary duty. My father's face darkened. Now see here. No, you see here, I interrupted, finding strength in my voice that surprised even me. I have copies of checks written from my trust account to pay for your vacation home in the Berkshires. I have documentation of management fees that conveniently matched the cost of Mother's luxury car leases. I have proof of trust assets being used as collateral for your business loans. With each example, I watched their carefully constructed facade crumble further. Several relatives who had initially seemed uncertain were now staring at my parents with undisguised shock and disapproval. My cousin Rachel, who had always been close to my mother, stepped away from Eleanor's side, the significance of her physical distancing not lost on anyone present. My father's golf buddies suddenly found their phones fascinating, avoiding eye contact with him. This is absurd, my father sputtered, his composure finally breaking. After everything we've done for you, we gave you a perfect life. You gave me anxiety and self-doubt, I countered calmly. You convinced me I was incapable of making my own decisions while systematically stealing my birthright. We did not steal, my mother's voice rose shrilly. We managed. We protected. Your grandmother never understood the complexities of modern finance. We made necessary adjustments to ensure security. Thomas Whitaker, who had remained diplomatically silent during much of the exchange, finally spoke up. Mrs. Lockhart, the trust agreement was explicitly clear about permitted expenses and management protocols. As someone who helped draft that document with Evelyn, I can state unequivocally that your adjustments violated both the letter and spirit of her wishes. A heavy silence fell over the gathering. Even those relatives who might have been inclined to give my parents the benefit of the doubt couldn't ignore the mounting evidence and the damning testimony of grandmother Evelyn's own attorney. My father, ever the strategist, attempted one final approach. His voice softened as he addressed me directly, ignoring the onlookers. Ren, sweetheart, I understand you're upset. We should have been more transparent with you as you got older, but everything we did out of love. You're making a terrible mistake that will tear this family apart. Is that really what you want? It was the same emotional manipulation he'd employed throughout my childhood, making me responsible for family harmony, suggesting that my actions, not his, would cause damage. For the first time, I saw the tactic clearly for what it was. The family was torn apart the moment you and mother decided to steal from your own daughter, I replied evenly. I'm simply bringing that truth to light. As if on cue, my phone chimed again. It was an email from the court confirming that a temporary restraining order had been granted, preventing my parents from accessing any of the remaining trust assets or property deeds. I held up my phone so they could see the notification. Effective immediately, you no longer have any legal access to or control over my inheritance, I announced loud enough for everyone to hear. Additionally, the court has frozen your personal assets pending investigation into the misappropriated funds. My father's face drained of color. You've frozen our accounts. This is outrageous. How are we supposed to live? The same way I was expected to live within your actual means, not with stolen money, I replied. There's still enough in your legitimate retirement accounts for you to maintain a modest lifestyle. You just won't be able to continue pretending to be wealthier than you actually are. My mother began to sway slightly, and for a moment I thought she might faint for dramatic effect, a tactic she'd employed during previous family disagreements. Instead, she straightened her spine and fixed me with a cold glare I'd never seen before. You ungrateful child, she hissed, abandoning all pretense of maternal concern. We gave you everything, and this is how you repay us. By humiliating us in front of the entire family. By destroying what we've spent decades building. What you built was a house of cards, mother, constructed with money that was never yours to spend. As the reality of their situation sank in, my parents' unified front began to fracture. My father turned on my mother, his voice low but intense. I told you we should have been more careful with the documentation. I told you those property transfers were too obvious, my mother recoiled. Don't you dare blame this on me. The management fees were your idea. You said no one would question them if we called them professional services. Watching them turn on each other confirmed what I'd always suspected. Their partnership had been built on mutual greed rather than principle or love. In their panic, they forgot they had an audience, that every accusatory word further incriminated them both. Uncle Philip attempted to intervene. Richard, Eleanor, this isn't helping. Perhaps we should continue this discussion privately. There's nothing left to discuss, I stated firmly. The courts will handle it from here. As if to punctuate my statement, 2 police officers appeared at the edge of our backyard. Thomas had mentioned the possibility of law enforcement involvement, but I hadn't expected them so soon. My father spotted them immediately, his face contorting with disbelief. You called the police on your own parents. On Independence Day, I shook my head. I didn't. But the district attorney's office has been investigating financial crimes in the trust management industry. It seems your creative accounting practices caught their attention months ago, independent of my case. This was news even to me. Thomas had received the information that morning, but had waited to tell me, unsure how it would affect my confrontation plans. The investigation had apparently been triggered when my parents attempted to liquidate one of the larger properties in my trust portfolio. As the officers approached, the family gathering dissolved into murmurs and shocked expressions. Some relatives discreetly began gathering their belongings, eager to escape the unfolding drama. Others lingered too, fascinated by the spectacular fall from grace to leave. My parents were not arrested that day. The officers merely served them with official notice of the investigation and instructed them not to leave the state. But the damage to their reputation was complete and irreversible. The carefully crafted image of the respected, wealthy, generous Lockharts had shattered beyond repair. By sunset, most guests had departed, leaving behind half-eaten plates and abandoned drinks. Aunt Caroline stayed, helping me gather essential documents and personal belongings. I would spend the night at her house before driving to New York the following morning to begin my new life. As we packed my car, my father appeared in the driveway, looking suddenly older and diminished without his usual confident posture. "Ren," he said, his voice hoarse, "you've made your point. You've won. Can't we find some way to resolve this within the family?" I studied the man who had controlled every aspect of my life for 25 years, who had stolen not just my money but my confidence and sense of self-worth. In that moment I felt neither hatred nor satisfaction, only a profound weariness and determination to move forward. "This isn't about winning, Dad, it's about truth and consequences. You and Mom will have your day in court, both for the civil claims and potentially criminal charges. Whatever happens, I won't be part of your lives anymore. You're really leaving, just like that, 25 years of family and you walk away." I closed my car trunk before answering. "We stopped being a real family the day you and Mom decided I was a resource to be exploited, rather than a daughter to be loved." He had no response to that. As Aunt Caroline and I drove away, I watched him in the rearview mirror, a solitary figure standing in the driveway of a house that had never truly been a home. My apartment in New York was smaller than a closet in my parents' house, but it was mine, secured with my own salary, furnished according to my own taste, and free from the suffocating control that had defined my former life. The first night I spent there, I sat cross-legged on the floor, my furniture wouldn't arrive for another day, and experienced a quiet joy I had never known before. For the first time, no one was monitoring my decisions or subtly undermining my confidence. My new position at Werner and Associates challenged me in ways my previous job never had. The projects were larger, the clients more demanding, and the expectations higher. But rather than crumbling under pressure as my parents had always predicted I would, I thrived. Without their constant negative influence, I discovered reserves of confidence and creativity I never knew I possessed. 2 weeks after my dramatic Independence Day revelation, Maya Desai called with an update on the financial investigation. "We've uncovered something unexpected," she said, her voice tight with professional restraint. "The diversion of funds from your trust wasn't limited to your parents' personal expenses. There are substantial transfers to a company called Lockhart Horizons LLC. "I've never heard of it," I replied, balancing my phone while unpacking architectural drawings in my new office. "That's because it doesn't officially exist, at least not as a functioning business. It appears to be a shell company your father created shortly after your grandmother died. The interesting part is where that money ultimately went." According to Maya's findings, my father had been using my trust funds to cover significant losses in his financial advisory business. For years he had been making increasingly risky investments with his clients' money, attempting to maintain the outsized returns that had built his reputation in the industry. When those investments failed, he used my inheritance to cover the shortfalls rather than admitting his mistakes. So he wasn't just stealing from me, I realized. He was using my money to sustain a financial fraud scheme with his clients. Exactly. The SEC has gotten involved now. This goes well beyond family financial mismanagement, it's potentially securities fraud on a significant scale. The revelation should have shocked me, but somehow it felt like the logical conclusion to my parents' deception. Their perfect image had always been more important than ethics or truth. My father's business reputation had been built on the same foundation of lies as our family dynamics. Thomas Whitaker called the following day with more updates. The courts had granted emergency orders to freeze all of my parents' personal assets. Their attempts to access offshore accounts had triggered additional regulatory scrutiny. The prestigious country club that had been the center of their social life had quietly asked them to take a leave of absence pending resolution of the legal matters. "They're facing civil suits from several of your father's clients," Thomas explained. "People who trusted him with their retirement funds are discovering their accounts aren't nearly as robust as his quarterly report suggested." I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. The parents I had grown up with, the respected community leaders, the charitable donors, the financial experts had been illusions. Behind the carefully maintained facade had been two deeply insecure people willing to steal from their own daughter and defraud trusting clients to maintain appearances. Aunt Caroline visited me in New York a month after my move, bringing with her a box of family photographs and letters she had salvaged from my grandmother's estate before my parents could dispose of them. "I've been holding on to these for years," she explained, as we sat in my tiny living room spreading the contents across my coffee table. "I always hoped there would come a day when you'd be ready to know the full truth about your grandmother." The photographs revealed a side of grandmother Evelyn I had never been allowed to see, a vibrant, independent businesswoman who had defied the conventions of her time to build her real estate empire. In one image, she stood proudly in front of her first commercial property acquisition, her expression determined and satisfied. In another, she held me as an infant, her face alight with the kind of unconditional love my parents had never shown. "She adored you," Caroline said softly. "From the moment you were born, she saw something special in you, a spark of the same independence and intelligence she valued in herself." Among the letters was correspondence between my grandmother and her attorney from the final years of her life. In them, she expressed concerns about my mother's jealousy and my father's financial ethics, worrying that they might not be the best guardians for her legacy. Yet she had hoped that the responsibility of managing my trust might inspire them to rise above their worst instincts. "She was always an optimist about people," Caroline explained. Even knowing Eleanor's flaws, she believed her daughter could change if given the chance to do the right thing. Most poignant were the letters grandmother Evelyn had written directly to me, letters my parents had intercepted and hidden. They were filled with wisdom, encouragement, and the kind of unconditional support I had never experienced growing up. "Trust your own judgment, little one," she had written, when I was just 5. "There will be those who try to make you doubt yourself, but remember that you come from a line of women who know their own minds." Reading her words felt like finally meeting the extraordinary woman who had tried to secure my future and independence. Though she was gone, her belief in me remained preserved in these letters that had finally reached their intended recipient. As the criminal and civil cases against my parents progressed, I maintained my distance, declining their increasingly desperate attempts to contact me. My father's legal team proposed a settlement that would have reduced my claims in exchange for dropping criminal charges, an offer Thomas advised me to reject outright. "They're still trying to manipulate you," he pointed out, "using your natural desire for family reconciliation to escape the full consequences of their actions." He was right. Even facing financial ruin and potential imprisonment, my parents were still attempting to control the narrative and my response to it. I instructed Thomas to proceed with all claims and to cooperate fully with the criminal prosecutors. My life in New York took on a rhythm entirely my own. I made new friends who knew nothing of my family drama or unexpected wealth. I dated without my mother's scrutiny or my father's intimidating interrogations of potential partners. I excelled at work, earning a promotion just 6 months into my new position. With the recovered portion of my inheritance, I established a scholarship fund for students of architecture from disadvantaged backgrounds, a way of honoring grandmother Evelyn's belief in providing opportunities for those with determination and talent. I lived primarily on my salary, using only small portions of my inheritance for occasional travel and experiences I had been denied growing up. 9 months after my dramatic Independence Day revelation, I received a call from Aunt Caroline. My father had been indicted on multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and financial elder abuse related to his management of client accounts. My mother faced lesser charges of conspiracy and tax evasion. Both had been arrested that morning. "How do you feel?" Caroline asked gently. I considered the question carefully, searching for the anger or satisfaction I might have expected to feel. Instead, I found a quiet resolution, a closing of one chapter and the continuing unfolding of another. I feel free, I answered finally. Not because of what's happening to them, but because their actions no longer define my life or my future. That evening, I stood at the window of my apartment, looking out at the New York skyline glittering against the night sky. I thought about the journey from that little girl who had been handed a savings passbook on her 6th birthday, to the woman I had become confident, independent, and finally in control of her own story. My parents had spent 25 years trying to convince me I wasn't capable of managing my own life. In freeing myself from their deception, I had discovered they were wrong about everything that mattered. 1 year to the day, after the confrontation that changed everything, I found myself standing outside a federal courthouse in Boston, watching as my parents emerged following their sentencing hearing. My father had received 8 years for securities fraud, wire fraud, and embezzlement. My mother had been sentenced to 3 years for her role in the conspiracy. Both would be required to make restitution to their victims, including me, though the full amount would likely never be recovered. I hadn't planned to attend the sentencing. My life in New York had developed its own momentum separate from the ongoing legal proceedings against my parents. But something had drawn me back to Boston that day, a need for closure perhaps, or simply a desire to witness this final chapter in person, rather than through attorneys' reports and news articles. They didn't see me at first. My father focused on navigating the press gathered on the courthouse steps, my mother keeping her head down beneath large sunglasses despite the overcast day. They looked smaller, somehow diminished by both the gravity of their crimes and the loss of the carefully constructed facade that had defined their existence. When my father finally spotted me standing across the street, he froze mid-step. My mother followed his gaze, her posture stiffening when she realized I was there. For a moment, the three of us existed in a tableau of shared history and irrevocable separation, a family in name only connected by blood, but divided by choices made long ago. My father took a hesitant step in my direction before his attorney firmly guided him toward their waiting car. My mother stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher, regret perhaps, or simply shock at my presence. Neither of them called out or attempted to approach me further. What was there to say after all that could bridge the chasm their actions had created? As their car pulled away from the curb, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, not dramatically but gradually, like the slow dissipation of a fog that had surrounded me my entire life. The proceedings were over. Justice, imperfect as it might be, had been served. I was free to focus completely on building my future rather than rectifying the past. That future had already begun taking shape in unexpected and fulfilling ways. The architecture firm had promoted me again, placing me in charge of a prestigious restoration project for a historical building in Manhattan. My work had been featured in several industry publications, with critics praising my innovative approach to blending historical preservation with modern functionality. The scholarship fund I'd established in grandmother Evelyn's name had already helped 5 talented students pursue their architectural dreams. I had become personally involved with the scholarship committee mentoring recipients and helping them navigate the challenges of entering a competitive profession. More personally, I had begun the process of renovating one of the properties I'd inherited, a Victorian townhouse, similar to the one that had first triggered my discovery of my grandmother's legacy. Working evenings and weekends, I was slowly transforming it into both a home that reflected my own aesthetic sensibilities and a testament to grandmother Evelyn's vision and business acumen. After leaving the courthouse, I met Aunt Caroline for lunch at a small cafe near the Boston Common. She had become a central figure in my life, the family I chose rather than the family I was born into. Through her stories and the letters she had preserved, I had formed a relationship with my grandmother that transcended her physical absence. "How are you feeling?" Caroline asked as we settled at our table. "Lighter," I replied. "Like I can finally put down something I've been carrying for years without realizing how heavy it was." She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Evelyn would be so proud of how you've handled all of this, not just reclaiming your inheritance, but what you've chosen to do with it. The way you've rebuilt your life on your own terms. I wish I could have known her, I said, a familiar pang of loss accompanying the words. In many ways you're just like her, Caroline smiled. The same determination, the same creative vision, the same refusal to let others define your worth or capabilities. After lunch, Caroline accompanied me to the cemetery where grandmother Evelyn was buried. I had visited once before shortly after the confrontation, but this visit felt different, less about mourning what had been lost, and more about honoring the connection that had endured despite my parents' efforts to sever it. We placed fresh flowers on her grave, and I took a moment to silently thank the woman who had tried to secure my future, and whose legacy had ultimately helped me claim my independence, even if not in the way she had envisioned. Later that afternoon, I visited Thomas Whitaker at his home. Now fully retired, he had maintained an interest in my case and my life, becoming something of a grandfather figure over the past year. "I have something for you," he said after welcoming me into his study. He withdrew a small wooden box from his desk drawer and handed it to me. "Evelyn left this with me with instructions that it should be given to you when you turned 25. With everything that happened, I only recently rediscovered it while organizing my files for retirement." Inside the box was a simple gold locket on a delicate chain. When opened, it contained a tiny photograph of grandmother Evelyn holding me as an infant, our faces close together, both smiling. On the opposite side was an inscription, "To wren fly with your own wings." "She had it made when you were just a few months old," Thomas explained. "She told me you had a spark in your eyes that reminded her of herself as a young woman. She wanted to ensure that spark wouldn't be extinguished." I fastened the locket around my neck, feeling a connection to my grandmother stronger than any inheritance could provide. She had tried to protect me not just financially but spiritually, to ensure I would eventually find the strength to claim my independence, regardless of the obstacles placed in my path. That evening, back in my hotel room, I opened my laptop to find an email from Maya Desai. The forensic investigation had uncovered additional funds in an offshore account my father had established years earlier. The courts had ruled that these assets should be returned to my trust, representing another portion of what had been taken from me. I sat looking at the figures on the screen, contemplating what to do with this unexpected recovery. After a moment's reflection, I began drafting a response to Maya, outlining my decision to allocate these funds to expand the scholarship program, creating additional opportunities for young people to pursue their dreams without the constraints I had faced. As I worked, I found myself thinking about the journey that had brought me to this point. My parents had spent decades trying to convince me I was incapable of managing my own life, let alone substantial assets. They had systematically undermined my confidence, isolated me from supportive influences, and created a narrative that served their interests at the expense of my development. Yet here I was, thriving professionally, managing my inheritance responsibly, creating opportunities for others, and building a life of my own design. Every decision I made now represented another step further from their shadow, and closer to the woman grandmother Evelyn had believed I could become. The next morning, before returning to New York, I visited the neighborhood where I'd grown up. The family home had been sold as part of the restitution agreement, its contents auctioned to compensate victims of my father's financial schemes. A young family had purchased it, and I could see children's toys in the yard where I had once played alone under my mother's watchful, critical eye. I felt no attachment to the house itself. It had never truly been a home in the emotional sense. But seeing it occupied by a new family, I hoped they would fill it with the warmth and genuine support that had been missing during my childhood there. Driving away, I realized I was not just leaving a physical location, but completing an emotional journey as well. The girl who had once been desperate for her parents' approval and acceptance no longer existed. In her place was a woman who understood her own worth, wasn't determined by others' assessments, but by the integrity of her choices and the authenticity of her life. Back in New York, I resumed work on my townhouse renovation. As I carefully restored original architectural details while incorporating contemporary elements, I thought about how the process mirrored my own transformation, preserving what was valuable from the past while building something new and authentic. On the anniversary of Grandmother Evelyn's birth, I hosted a small gathering at the nearly completed townhouse. Aunt Caroline was there along with Thomas Whitaker, Maya Desai, several of my new friends from New York, and the first group of scholarship recipients who were now completing their studies. Standing in the front parlor surrounded by people who had supported my journey or benefited from my grandmother's legacy, I raised a glass in toast. To Evelyn Montgomery Lockhart, I said, who believed in the power of independence and the importance of determining your own path. Her legacy lives on, not just in buildings and bank accounts, but in the opportunities she's still creating for others through all of us gathered here. Later, as guests mingled throughout the house, I stepped out onto the small balcony off the master bedroom. The city stretched before me, its lights shimmering against the evening sky. I touched the locket at my throat, thinking of the woman who had tried to secure my future and whose wisdom had finally reached me despite all efforts to prevent it. I flew with my own wings, Grandma, I whispered to the night air. Just as you hoped I would. The journey from controlled daughter to independent woman had been painful and challenging, but standing there I felt only gratitude for the strength I had discovered within myself, and for the authentic life I was continuing to build, one decision one day at a time. My parents had spent years trying to convince me I needed them to navigate the world. In breaking free from their control, I had discovered that the greatest inheritance my grandmother left me wasn't financial wealth, but the example of her courage and the confidence she had tried to instill in me from afar. Some family legacies are measured in dollars and assets. The most valuable ones, I had learned, are measured in freedom, authenticity, and the courage to chart your own course, even when those who should support you become obstacles you must overcome. I had saved myself not just from financial fraud, but from a lifetime of diminished possibilities and controlled potential. And in that salvation I had discovered that the strongest foundations aren't built with others' expectations, but with your own determination to become the architect of your authentic life. Wow, what a journey we've been through together. I'd love to know if you've ever experienced or witnessed family situations where someone had to stand up for themselves against manipulation. Has karma ever delivered justice in your life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of overcoming family betrayal and finding personal strength resonated with you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more powerful stories. Thank you so much for watching until the end. It means the world to me. Remember, sometimes the greatest act of self-love is believing in your own worth, even when those who should support you try to undermine it. Until next time.